Welcome to Artist Tales, the podcast that features and celebrates artists from different walks of life. I'm your host, Heather Martin, and in this episode, I'm joined by London-based writer Libro Levi Bridgeman. A non-binary writer, editor, lecturer, and performer, Libro blends the critical inquiry with the rawness of lived experience. They trained at E.15 Drama School and began their artistic life with new writing theatre companies. Their commitment to queer storytelling is unwavering, from the deeply personal Letter to My Little Queer Self to the internationally acclaimed The Butch Monologues, a verbatim theatre project described as a very tangible vehicle for social change. Libro's voice resonates across film, fiction, and festival panels. Their work exploring gender, identity, queer desire, creative resistance, and visibility for those so often erased. Co-founder of Hotpencil Press and a featured speaker from Manchester to Melbourne, Libro reminds us that storytelling isn't just art, it's activism. Welcome, Libro.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's great having you as a guest. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into kind of being the writer, editor, and performer you are today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of an interesting first question, really. When I was a kid, I was at school. I was a little bit caught between. I wasn't the bright kid. I wasn't the sporty kid. I wasn't I came from a family. I had two older brothers that were quite academically successful, and I kind of was like sort of the one that wasn't kind of achieving at school. And I found a time to sort of find a place for me to fit into. And as you're kind of being brought up, your parents shove you into this class, and they try and get something going for you. And I stumbled across acting classes at school when I was 12, and I totally fell in love with the idea of being an actor. And just as you cited in your initial introduction, I applied to drama school, I left school, moved to London, applied to drama school, and I got into East 15. And I thought that was what I was going to do. I was going to be an actor. And of course, it's, this was back in 1987. So in terms of the gender binary being very much in place, and if you're not the sort of like going to play the young lead, the young heroine, you're always going to be the character part. Cut to the chase. I mean, I did a 3-year training there, and cut to the chase, I left in 1990, and I had a few jobs with performing theatre companies, and I did some touring East European tours and stuff. But I really hated that feeling of being an actor waiting for the phone to ring. And this is back in the day before mobile phones, so you're literally at home, you're sending out CVs, and then you're literally at home waiting for your landline to ring to see whether you've got an audition or a part. So I kind of got a bit frustrated with that. So I started to write, and I didn't really know how I was writing or what I was writing, but I just stepped into that space and I started to develop my own material. So that would have been sort of like the early 90s. And I was doing stuff at the Oval House Theatre in the early 90s and started to do my own solo work, and then started to write plays. And actually, strangely enough, I'm very long-standing friends with Joelle Taylor. And Joelle Taylor was coming out of the Oval House making work and writing about lived experiences around the same time. So that's how the intersection of sort of performance and writing sort of came about for me. And then the acting fell away because it's hard to just wait by the phone and wait for someone to give you a job. And people kind of responded to the writing in a really specific way. So I just pushed the writing and I kept on moving through. And in 1997, I applied for some money from what was then called the London Arts Board and is no longer there. And in 1997, I applied to do a piece of work called Lunatic, which is about runaways and missing people. Joelle Taylor was the director of that piece. And I got my first serious funding. I got £15,000 to make that piece of work. And I felt like a millionaire. And Joelle and I worked on that piece of work. And then that for me was the turning point. And I sort of stopped looking for acting jobs. And I thought, I'm just going to throw my weight behind writing and see where that takes me. So I was kind of doing like a commission a year, I guess. That sort of from Lunatic, I got invited to Payne's Plough writing workshop. Sarah Kane was leading the workshop. I got picked up by Radio 4. So I had a little flurry. And I always say this to students that I work with or emerging artists: work leads to work. So I was in Payne's Power Writing Shop, and then I did some Radio 4 plays. And then I carried on for a little while. And then 2002, I thought about really thinking about writing as a practice more seriously. And I'd never been taught how to write or to think about writing just on its own terms. And that's when I applied to go to UEA, and I got into the creative writing program there. And I did an MA in creative writing there.
And just to clarify, UEA, is that the University of
East Anglia? Yeah.
Yeah, East Anglia.
So it still has a very well-respected, recognized creative writing program. I'd never done a first degree because I went to drama school, but they accepted me because I'd had commissions as a writer. I was working as a professional writer. And it's the first time I ever wrote any academic papers. I was completely out of my depth. But in the cohort or in the writing program that I was part of, and in my class, Naomi Alderman was in my class. And so it felt like, at the time, I went there really to raise my game and to just be in a space with other writers. And they were more or less text-based writers, novelists, short story writers. So it's a completely different medium for me. But I kind of really enjoyed being in workshop, developing my own creative practice. And yeah, it was pretty challenging having other writers read your work and then feed back to you. And you had to sort of deliver 5,000 words. So you were kind of under the microscope, but I think it was a fantastic experience for me. And then from that MA program that finished in 2003, I then signed up to the PhD. I don't know why I did that, but anyway, I did that.
And would you like to talk a bit about your PhD?
Yeah, I suppose I could. Yeah, I worked with I had an amazing supervisor in 2002 to 2003 called Patricia Dunker, who's written a number of novelists, who's written a number of texts. One in particular that I love called James Miranda Barry, which is about a sort of a masculine presenting surgeon who passed as male, actually. Patricia and I had this like a massive connection, and she was always very, very supportive of my work. And then I said that I think the MA started in September and finished in June, so it's not even a full year. And I said to her, I really feel like my feet haven't touched the ground, and I would like maybe to do a PhD, but I didn't have any funding or anything in place. And at the time, I was telling my flatmate at the time, they were charging £2,800 for an MA or a PhD just in fees. I mean, now that looks like, tuppence. But I didn't have any money to do the PhD. And then Patricia sort of front loaded my experience. And then they were able to, actually the university covered for my fees to do the PhD. So suddenly I was signed up to the PhD. And then I did a critical paper on writing as process. And then I developed a novel in the same time. But I mean, a PhD is, as anyone would tell you, is an arduous task. And that I completed everything and got the PhD in 2009.
So it sounds like quite the journey. And from the sound, yeah, it also sounds like quite an adjustment from where you were in just, developing writing to a very academic space and having those connections and, the reviews from peers or other writers. What's that impact on you? How has that affected you in your writing?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. And, if I have a son, me and my ex-partner raised my son. My son is now 36. I'm not the birth parent, but I raised my son from sort of the age of 3.5, and he went through the school system. But actually, my ex-partner's French. My son went and did a baccalaureate in the French lycée down in London. And he was already doing philosophy at school. And he was already engaging with areas of critical thinking, like inside the school program before doing the baccalaureate. And I think for me, well, obviously that's not really taught in the English school system. But for me, I think what the PhD gave me was this chance to explore and really develop ideas around critical thinking because initially when I was writing academic papers, my supervisor Patricia Dunker used to say to me, "What are you writing? That this isn't an academic paper. You're just writing your thoughts and your feelings." So to back up everything with sort of reading material, support every argument that you've got. So it's a totally new experience for me. And it was an opportunity for me to develop that side of my brain. But I just feel that just looking at my son, who did that inside a school program, if we had a different school program inside the UK, young people would be getting into that space much earlier on. And it's not, I mean, people say, oh, PhD and this, that, and the other, and it is a big ask. But at the same time, academic writing is just a technique. And I think people are fearful of it. And, I acknowledge the graft, obviously, of it. And I acknowledge the sort of dedication you need to have to your creative work, any kind of practice that you're doing a PhD on. But at the same time, I think there's a sort of a prejudged fear that you have, oh, I can't possibly do that. But actually, I found as soon as I got my head around it, as I say, it's just a technique. And actually, I think what's harder to achieve certainly for writers and to keep hold of is this idea of voice and originality of thought and point of attack. And when I teach students in university, that's what I'm trying to get across. It doesn't matter how academic or intellectual you are. And we know so many writers that barely get through a school program and are phenomenal creative writers. It's just about that, really. So as a writer, not to overthink things, but you can certainly step into a space where you're sort of breaking down ideas and looking at concepts and obviously putting research into it. But also, if you don't have originality of thought or you don't have a point of attack, you're not going to produce a PhD as well. So for me, it's more about those components.
So it sounds like it has influenced you and certainly given those insights for you. Now, I did mention some of your writing, like The Letter to My Little Queer Self and the Butch Monologues. Would you like to talk a little bit more about how those two pieces of work came about?
Yeah, I mean, I run a press called Hotpencil Press, and I set that up 11 years ago with a long-standing friend of mine and now also a work colleague. So Serge approached me. Serge, is a transmasculine activist, really, who started something called Transfabulous back in the day that people remember with enormous fondness. And he approached me and said, I'm thinking of doing a piece of work, like a stage show, a little bit like the Vagina Monologues, but with a cast of transmasculine people. But I'm not a writer, so I need to work with her. And I looked at Serge, so this would have been 2009. And I looked at him and I said, that's probably the best thing that anyone's ever said to me. So we worked together on that and we took interviews. So it was the first time I worked in areas of verbatim theatre and I really didn't have any experience of that at all. I'd written about my own life, but I hadn't sort of recorded other people's lives. So we did that as a collection. It was called the Transmangina Monologues. And that was our first publication. It came out as There Is No Word for It, which is about finding language for your body. And Lois Weaver from Split Britches Theatre Company and an icon in Butch Femme Theatre worked as a director with us on that piece of work. And we performed it at Queen Mary and at Soho Theatre. And there was kind of a big response to it and a positive response to it. And then probably in, I think, 2010 or 2011, I was, obviously sort of the Facebook days were kind of with us. And I was going out on the scene and I was working in a club called Bird Club, which was run by Bird La Bird. And it was down in Bethnal Green, working men's club. And the sort of like, in terms of the presentation, I, was turning up to work suited and booted. And so I was hanging out in particular with other butchers during that time. And somebody called Aston Martin, who used to work down at the British Museum, approached me on Facebook and said, I'm interested in forming a butch club, a butch members club. Would you like to join? And I'd only ever met them socially or whatever. So I was like, okay, I'll join. I don't know what we're going to do, but I'll join. So we ended up meeting in an apartment, in their apartment. And then we met, the second time we met, there were 6 of us originally. And the second time we met, it kind of grew and we met in Dawson Superstore. And everybody was talking. It's the first time I really got intimate, I suppose, with other butchers or masculine presenting people. And we were talking about the experience you have, going into the toilet and somebody challenging you, or stuff you might hear in the street, or what you wear to work, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just sat there listening to people's experiences that were some of them were very similar to my own, and some of them were very different. And it just came to me, and I said, maybe I want to move into a space where I record our stories. Because at the time in 2010, 2011, the transmasculine space, cultural space, was being taken up by people that are transitioned. But the butch voice was kind of lost. And as a butch presenting person, you were potentially considered as trans light if you weren't transitioning. So I kind of said to the people around me, would you be interested in being, and they were kind of like, yeah, whatever. So I started to take recordings, and then I approached somebody called Julie McManara, who's a theatre director who I'd known for a very long time. And I said, I want to do a piece called the Butch Monologues, and I'm starting to record stories. They jumped on board. And then Chance Chachowska, who was running Diva magazine at the time, put it forward to the South Bank for a festival called Wow Festival. And we went down there for a meeting, and there were already photos of us. The butch company that I joined was called the Drakes. And people were taking photos of us, and we were all just suited and booted and rocking up to events. And we presented it to the committee at the South Bank, and they accepted it. We went into the rehearsal. I took more interviews, spliced the stories together. We went into a rehearsal room with 5 butches. Some of them didn't have stage experience at all. We presented it down at Wow Festival in a small studio space in the basement, the Blue Room. And people buy tickets for Wow Festival and then rock up to whatever events they want to attend. We started doing the piece, and the door was swinging open. I did the introduction to the show, and then the show kicked off, and the door was banging, banging, banging. And I came back and I spoke to one of the ushers. I said, what's going on? Because we had, 60 people in the space. And the usher said to me, I've got 200 people waiting outside trying to get in. This is the first ever showing. And so we didn't realize, I don't know, we were excited by the work. We were proud of the work. We didn't realize the cultural impact that it would have. And I turned around to the director and I said, maybe we'll do it for a couple of years. And, we toured that show for 10 years. We toured it, and we went to Belfast with it. We went to New York with it. We went to Australia with it. Everywhere we went, we sold out. And that was it. I was trying to sort of engage a younger audience and ask sort of people that were mask presenting to come and talk to me. And a lot of people at the time said, I don't classify as butch because it has negative connotation. But now the landscape is very, very different. So there's a sort of a celebration of butch. The first publication we did of the Butch Monologues through Hotpencil Press and also Vital Exposure collaboration. The first print run we did in 2017. We sold out 3 times of a print run. We don't do anything on that activity at all. So the work is in the world. Somebody posted it on TikTok a few months back. We got 22,000 likes on TikTok. It has enormous cultural traction that we're very, very proud of. And then moving on from the Butch Monologues, which we didn't know would still have cultural currency now. Serge and I were talking during pandemic about how we advance the press and the publishing company. Everyone was stuck at home. So I said to Serge, why don't we do a letters collection? So this is, in answer to your question, this is how Letter to My Little Queer Self came about, because everyone was stuck at home. And we reached out to 29 activists and artists. Some are not sort of like, established writers or anything. And we said, everyone's stuck at home. Would you like to consider writing for this project? Write to your former self. And everybody just jumped on. So we came up with that collection. It was the first time we worked with the designers, Design Print Bind, and they did a fantastic book for us, which is, the design is really important to us. It's also tiny. We decided to go with a small book that fits into a jacket pocket or a handbag. And that we had to do an online launch because everyone was stuck at home. So that we did in 2021. And again, we just keep on doing more and more print runs. So we've got some incredible writers and artists and activists in that work. And it was the first time that we thought about making a collection with very distinct different voices and different tones and different lengths of pieces, and then how you do a story arc for a collection. So yeah, and that's both the Butch Monologues and Letter to My Little Queer Self sell constantly in bookshops and online, and yeah, it just hasn't stopped. The appetite hasn't stopped.
So it really sounds like it's tapping into, people's experiences, or that, or giving people an opportunity to kind of perhaps read about themselves or explore that sort of queer culture, or potentially who they are as well. Because what I'm thinking of, and what struck me from earlier on in the interview or our conversation, is your comment about people responding to your writing in a very specific way. Is this sort of the engagement you're getting? Is that sort of what you're referring to, or has the engagement changed over the years?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. It's just like, I think as a writer or an editor or somebody that's running their own press, I think for me the key is just to be inside the work like a rock. And you really committed to the work, and you really believe in the work, and you really believe in the people that you're working with and you're collaborating with. I think it's a danger to think about how a readership or an audience might respond. It's not your responsibility how people respond. You can't predict it. You can't, it's kind of slightly, I don't know, you can't manipulate it. You can't patronize it. So I think for me, the sign off is I absolutely believe in this work. I'm absolutely inside this work like a rock, and you can't do anything about that. And whether people like it or don't like it or shut it down or what, it's kind of, for me, that's the sign off as an artist, really, and as an editor, and being in communication and in conversation with people that are delivering their work to us and are trusting us to do that. And I think Serge and I, we run Hotpencil Press. People sort of say, well, how do you do this and how do you do that? And actually, we kind of keep the brief quite broad. So we've just produced another collection called Letter to My Little Trans Self. And we don't dictate or prescribe. Some people would like to write a very traditional letter to their former selves. Other people might come in with a poem or haiku or something like quite esoteric. And we don't ever prescribe what people should do. We have a cutoff for a word count. Sometimes people we've worked with, we did a launch at the ICA last Wednesday, actually. And one of Bambi, Jordan Phillips, worked with us. And Bambi's really from a sort of a club scene and a voguing practice, very, very well respected, and a dancer, very well respected. And when Bambi came up to take the microphone, she said, I don't feel like a writer, and I feel self-conscious because we had, other sort of recognized writers like Juliet Jakes, Lauren J. Joseph, Saba Chowdhury, Gareth Gavin, Dee Mortimer, Eva Echo. We had some sort of like very established kind of writing voices on stage. But actually afterwards, Bambi said, I feel now I should do more writing. I want to do more writing. And I think for us, it's always, to reach out to people, to be part of the experience. And we're not going to sort of be elitist about who gets to do what, or we're only going to work with people that are, 5 or 10 years inside their writing practice. So I think in terms of that, you get a different readership as well. And you invite people, I've worked in 5 UK prisons teaching creative writing. So I've worked with a body of people who don't believe that, maybe their stories are anything, maybe they can write anything, maybe they've got anything of value to put down on a page. And I think those kind of voices, sometimes that's the key, and you can unlock a key, or the key that can unlock a door. And I think for us, it's always to go back to what we're trying to produce, and our sign off is on that. So whoever reads it, whoever experiences or whatever, I think you kind of can't quite predict what an audience can do. And I certainly did not, the Butch Monologues in particular, I certainly didn't ever envisage the social impact of that, really. It changed my life.
What I'm hearing, though, is you seem to be capturing kind of authenticity, or an authentic voice. Perhaps people who are not polished, who are not, who write from a real authentic or unpolished sort of way, or, don't have the veneer of they've done hundreds or thousands of interviews, or they've written hundreds or thousands of things. And also what you're also just, touching on with your publications are voices, as I've mentioned in my introduction, that are not visible or have been erased, and there just is such appetite to feel seen and heard. And I'm wondering if it's a combination of all those things that kind of draws people in and engage with the work.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think that's a sort of feels like a cultural positioning as well. I was recently I've just got back from Dublin with a stop motion film. I wrote a piece. I'm a grandparent, and I wrote a poem for my grandson, who's based in France with my son and his partner. And I also just recently have a granddaughter as well. So my grandson's 3.5, and my granddaughter's about 3 months old. And I wrote a poem about trying to explain to a young person that I'm not a grandmother and I'm not a grandfather. I'm a non-binary grandparent, and how does that look and feel? And I think for me, always it's about, it's a good point about making the invisible visible or being conduit for those stories. But when I was out in Dublin, I met somebody her name's Anna Nolan, and she works in a TV company based in Dublin. And I think we were talking about the sort of lived experience. So I guess Anna's sort of similar age to me. I'm 58, so I think she's 55 or whatever. And it feels like that's a kind of a cultural movement as well, for people to own their own stories, own their own experiences, own their own neurodiversity. And it feels like for us, from our generation, that wasn't really the case. I think there was a lot of only certain people can tell their own stories. Only that's kind of pale male stale. So if you're cisnormative, heterosexual, white, middle class, you can tell but nobody else has got the right to do that. But I think TV, even though people kind of like have a complicated relationship with reality TV shows, I think what that has done is change the landscape in terms of people stepping up and saying, I have Tourette's, I'm autistic, I'm on this show. So it feels like quite a contemporary area of discussion or unpacking our own lives. And I think for people from my generation, that feels quite refreshing and new. But certainly back in the day, I don't think people would have owned their own lived experiences in the same way that they do now. So there's kind of agency in that there wasn't in, certainly, I was a kid growing up in the 70s. And it's like you weren't kind of, if you had, I don't know, say you were dyslexic, or there would be shame around that and people wouldn't be vocal about that. But that's a shift. That's a cultural shift. So in terms of your point, people not being visible and people who become visible, I think that feels energetically, that feels like a contemporary conversation that's happening now. And I think people of my generation can totally tap into that space and say, actually, I think that's really healthy. And that feels progressive as well.
Yeah, and I'm mindful that, we are really starting, and I'm debating whether to use the word starting, but, there are more conversations around neurodiversity or Tourette's or, gender and sexuality. But I'm conscious that with those conversations, the kind of, backlash or pushback from people, being woke or whatever, terms they want to use to push back on that. So, I mean, how does that feel for you, or how do you think your work kind of sits within a contemporary conversation where, we're starting to talk about things more, but also that kind of pushback on those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, look at the political climate, Trump, Keir Starmer, the role. I lived through Section 28, Section 28 in this country. And now you're not allowed to promote homosexuality in schools as of 2026. So that's what Keir Starmer is putting on the table. Who's, what's more offensive to us or more triggering for us? That's a Labour politician. We lived through Margaret Thatcher. Obviously he was a Conservative. So it feels like things are being rolled back, and it feels like very vigilant, aggressive times. And this idea, you used the word woke. This idea that things have gone too far and we need to dial it back. I think I'm mindful of that, and I think there is a dialogue around that. And I mentioned my age. I'm sort of like more concerned about people that are teenagers or in their early 20s who've only experienced a landscape of permission, and now that's being removed, and how problematic that can feel. Kate Bornstein wrote on Facebook, and I don't know how long ago it was, maybe 6-8 months ago, and said, we've been here before. obviously Kate Bornsey is based in New York. We've been here before. We feel that everything's been taken away from us, but actually we've gone 10 steps forward and now things are being removed and maybe we're going 6 steps back, but we're still 4 steps forward. So I think it's about feeling like a sort of a bandwidth within it and feeling that things are flexible, even though, trans healthcare is being removed, puberty blockers are being removed. We understand that we're under attack and there are things that are not going to be possible anymore in the way that they were possible. But within that, I take a lot of comfort, I guess, and a lot of inspiration from the fact that the community is coming together and galvanizing. I went on the first march that was happening just post the Supreme Court ruling that came through, and that fell over the Easter weekend. And I think the police were expecting 200 people to turn up, and there were 20,000 people that turned up to that. And people cancelled Easter weekend in order to get trains to come into London. I went on the Trans Pride March in London just Saturday before. What was it? Saturday, was it the 26th? 100,000 people there. So the community is very strong and very, very powerful. And, somebody's always going to say something about something. Oh, you're too woke, or you're too this, or you're too that. Well, we get it. It doesn't really matter what anybody says to you, I guess. It's the fact that gender's out of the box. As you say, kind of language is out of the box in terms of people expressing and owning who they might be. Working with a student population, I now might kind of ask people to come up in the first break, and describe to me if they feel comfortable about what their neurodiversity might be. Before, out of a class of 20, I might get 3 people come up and say, this is who I am. And now you get half a class will come up. You get 8 to 10 people come up explaining their personal situation. So for me, it feels, I think it's really incredible that young people are feeling confident in that and actually acknowledging who they might be and how that serves them in terms of their passage through the world. And certainly, being raised or growing up in the 70s, you didn't have access to the language at all.
And just for clarification and background for listeners, the Supreme Court judgment you referenced in the UK is to do with how women or gender is defined, or women as a gender is defined, and that's based on a very narrow definition of biological. So just for clarity for listeners. But just listening to you speaking, I'm also hearing, or also thinking actually, it makes your work even more relevant, or very relevant even in today's world. I'm sure it would have been relevant even in the 70s, but it's even now very relevant in giving people language and access to actually, I'm not alone.
I think it's, when we did our present collection, Letter to My Little Trans Self, we wanted to work exclusively with the trans and non-binary community. And we reached out to approach 30 activists and artists and writers. And they started writing their letters, and we kind of assembled the collection. We finished assembling the collection probably sort of September, October last year. We didn't know how the landscape was going to change. We didn't know the Supreme Court ruling was coming in. And it just, people wrote in the spirit of the thing, and obviously the spirit of the time with which they were approached. And then it's just, we did the launch at the ICA, and one of the questions I asked the people on stage is like, how would your letters have been different if we'd approached you now? So, we're sort of constantly in flux, but I think language is important. And I think trying to kind of articulate the lived experience, and that's a point that you've been constantly referring to during this interview. I think trying to capture the lived experience is also important. And sometimes finding a language for that or finding a tone for that is the artist's struggle. And I think then if you don't know, like for us, we've taken down these stories. We've got a new collection. We're selling it in indie bookshops. We're selling it online. It's been available for about 6 weeks. We've already sold out half our print run. I just think there's an enormous appetite now And I'm really sort of cheered by the fact that people are committing to the reading experience as opposed to sitting on YouTube or sitting, you know what I mean? People actually, it's important for a lot of people. I read a lot of stuff on Kindle, but a lot of people want a book in their hand, So I think that also is, quite moving for me. And you don't know, you just put some work out in the world that you believe in, and it might resonate with a few people, or it might be exciting or dynamic or powerful. But as I said before, I think if you start a collection thinking about that, or starting a piece of work thinking about that, you probably won't achieve. I think you probably won't achieve it.
Now, my last question is, what's next? Do you have an idea of where your career might go?
Yeah, nice. I mean, as every artist, you kind of think you've got sort of irons in the fire. I have a TV script sort of hanging out there in TV land. So we'll see what happens to that. And that's about a queer family. It's a queer family road movie. So I'm trying to get that out into the world. And then I just took, it always for me, and we've kind of discussed like the different, intersections of my practice and different way things have taken me. More recently, I've been committing to writing poetry. Don't really consider myself a poet. And I had I submitted a piece of work. I had a hip replacement in 2020. I had osteoarthritis and was in a lot of pain. And I had a hip replacement in 2020. So I wrote about my experience of having osteoarthritis. It was a general call out it was called, the anthology is called Effable, and it was set up by 2 editors, and they had sort of a mentorship under 14 poems. And I put in, they were looking for queer, crip, kind of erotic poetry. And I wrote a piece of work and I just sent it in. So that's just been produced and is out in the world. And it kind of, we did a presentation at ESOP down in Soho for Pride. They do a kind of free, they take all the products out of the shop and they put books in the shop. And we all did, there's 4 of us, they wanted to sort of highlight the trans and non-binary writers this year. So the 4 of us took stalls and we did the reading, and I did a sort of a small kind of intro at the beginning. And I said, I don't really consider myself a poet, but I've started to work with language and material in short form like this. And then afterwards, the editor said, we didn't know that when we read your stuff. So I'm just stepping into a space of looking around, looking at anthologies that I can, maybe get my work into. And that feels quite empowering because it's a short form, which I love, but the discipline is absolutely there. And again, as we've discussed tonight, this feeling of the lived experience and language. And it feels you could get out a sort of a rapid fire of ideas in a short form that can have a lot of impact as well. So I'm kind of excited about that. And I just want to keep applying for anthologies, get the work in the world and see how that builds.
It sounds like you have a number of irons in the fire, so to speak. Well, I'd like to thank you. It's been wonderful speaking with you, and I wish you all the best in your future projects.
Thank you, Heather. It's been great actually to chat tonight. Sorry the camera's not been working, but I've been delighted to see your face. It's made it easier for me to speak. But no, it's been a great opportunity. Thank you for the offer and the invite.
Not a problem, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to my conversation with Libro. What a powerful way to close this series. I hope their reflections on queer storytelling, creative resistance, and the art of listening left you inspired. If this episode spoke to you, be sure to explore Libra's work through the links in the show notes. And if Artist Tales became part of your creative journey, help us keep the momentum going. Share the podcast with your friends, your community, or anyone who finds meaning in the stories behind art. This series may be wrapping up, but the journey continues. I'm already looking forward to bringing you more voices, more visions, and more artistic tales in the next series. Until then, stay curious, keep creating, and let your story echo in the world around you.